This is a production of Cornell University.
So I'd like to add to the list of topics that Barnaby identified as important for moving forward in the social sciences, the study of cooperation in complex societies. And in order to make this argument, I would rely on some experience I gathered from doing research on cooperation among farmer cooperatives. But I will also try to speak a bit more generally about what are our conceptual tools right now in terms of studying cooperation and the related concept that is the concept of social capital, and how we should try to move forward. I want to really speak directly to the topic of blurring interdisciplinary boundaries, but I by talking a bit about about this research I did in Uganda. You'll see how in some ways you can get different disciplines. Never do two things at a time. You can get different disciplines to speak to each other, hopefully in a profitable way. Let's see. Does it work? It's fine? Okay. So the topic of collective action and how do groups overcome collective action problems is a very common one across many disciplines, for sure economics, social sociology, and political science. And the problem has been around for quite some time. The general idea is that in several situations, everybody would benefit from the provision of a public good, but in order to cooperate, individuals have to overcome some basic social dilemmas. These social dilemmas might entail coordination problems, threshold problems, but most of all, the most prominent, pervasive, is the so-called free rider problem, which is a situation in which individuals would benefit from a provision of a public good, but their best interest would be that everybody else would contribute to the provision of the good while they'll just benefit from its presence. The classical examples are, of course, for instance, participation to a strike. Ideally, from the strike, the collectivity can learn, can gain some positive outcomes, but for the individual, the best thing is that the other people go on strike and he goes to work, and so he can make his salary for the day as well as enjoying the fact that the other people have contributed to increasing his benefits and other collective claims. In very general terms, the literature, again in very different disciplines, has provided two general type of solutions. One I identify as centralized solutions, in which some sort of leadership is in charge of coordination, control, and sanctioning, and think here about the state, taxation systems, the police, and so on. A second set of solutions, I organize them under the label of decentralized solutions, and they all have to do with the idea that through informal communication, social networks, peer pressure, groups develop norms of solidarity and reciprocity that allow them to overcome these collective action problems. And what I'm going to talk about today are these type of decentralized solutions. And the basic idea here that has been sort of backed up by a lot of empirical evidence based on observational data. Think about the literature on social movements, for instance, as well as a fair amount of computer modeling, simulations, formal modeling, is the idea that interpersonal influence and social networks might lead to positive collective outcomes. The question that I believe we should focus a bit more is to identify which are the mechanisms that make it possible for groups to overcome collective action problems. And in very general terms, I try to classify them in two broad categories. The first has to do with the motivations that individuals have. So the classical way in which these collective action problems are framed is that self-regarding individuals would always decide to free ride, so not to participate to the production of a public good, because for them that's the best outcome. At the same time, a bunch of scholars in different disciplines have argued that individuals are not selfish, and we should factor in these explanations of collective action some sort of other guarding motivation. And these, on this continuum between like selfish to pro-social behavior, we can identify two types of other guarding motivation. One is generalized altruism, which is altruism that is targeted to unknown others, to almost everybody else, and a form of other regarding motivation that is more specific, which is like group solidarity. So we behave differently toward a member of our family than a stranger, or we behave differently toward someone in our church, or in our soccer club, or in our department. So the idea here is that people are embedded in like different social spheres, and as the closer they perceive the alters to be, the members of their group to be, the more they are likely to overcome collective action problems on the basis of some sort of a group identity and solidarity. Now, the second set of potential solution to to collective action problems has not so much to do with the individual motivations per se, whether individuals are selfish or pro-social, but with the expectations that actors have about the behavior of other actors. And in this case, what becomes relevant here is the idea that in many contexts, these collective action situations occur over so-called repeated interactions, and the idea is here that people are facing these situations over time with the same other members of the group. And the intuition, starting from the tit-for-tat strategy to many other similar ideas in sociology and political science, is that as soon as the individuals realize that they are into this together, the payoff function of the individual might change, because in the long term, it becomes more convenient to cooperate than to free ride. So in these like repeated interaction situations, two general mechanisms have been identified. One is reciprocity, classical like tit for tat, and also the Elinor Ostrom work on communication becomes relevant here. And the second is the threat of sanctioning. While reciprocity through communication does not really change individual payoff, because in one sense, in some sense, like people can always free ride, in contexts in which there is some sort of sanctioning in place, either monetary or reputational, what happens is that the payoff function of the individual changes as well. So in this second set of potential solutions to collective action problems, the distinction becomes between some sort of like group commitment that is based on dynamics of reciprocity and sanctioning that essentially constitutes a real loss for the individual. Now, what I believe could be, and has been for my research and could be a general development for this literature, is the incorporation in research activities of behavioral games in order to directly address and decouple these different mechanisms. So essentially, the distinction of these, like the identification of these four mechanisms has been like out there for a while, although produced by in different fields and disciplines. At the same time, in a relatively independent way, behavioral economics has produced a fair amount of knowledge in terms of behavior of people in dictator and public goods games, as well as many other games. And what I'm suggesting, which gives you a sense of how interdisciplinary work might enhance our understanding of this phenomena, is that like one can measure empirically these different mechanisms through the use of behavioral games in the field. So this is essentially what I did in my research in Uganda, and my subjects were farmers who became members of farmer cooperatives, and the research question was, how is it possible that some of these farmer cooperatives did exceptionally well and others really didn't manage to get off the ground? And essentially they were all facing the same basic collective action problems. I won't get into the details, papers are available, but the thing here is there were no differences in terms of these farmers' competence, the size of their land, and so on. What really differed was the way in which they interacted with each other and the way in which they built a sense of community. So the idea here was, let's see whether like the study of social networks and the mechanisms that might lead to greater cooperation in a collective action situation can be helpful. I will just like give you a general example of how I went to study these 4 different mechanisms. And essentially, the dictator game, I assume most of you are familiar with it, is a situation in which anonymous players are required to divide in a given amount of money. And usually 2 individuals are paired. One person is assigned the entire amount of money. And this person has to decide how much to give to himself and how much to give to the other person. And whatever this person decides to keep to himself is his, and whatever he gives to the other person is the other person's to bring home. It's anonymous. These people don't interact with each other later on. And therefore, from an individual perspective point of view, if individuals were completely selfish, what we would expect is that they would keep everything to themselves. The decider won't give anything to the other person. But in reality, what we observe is that people actually end up like giving something to the other participant. In general, like the modal behavior is to give nothing, but the average behavior is to give like 30% of endowment, and people end up like giving up to 50%. Now, what I did was actually take this game and twist it a bit in order to study the level of generalized altruism and group solidarity among these farmers. So I won't get into the details, but essentially every farmer in my farmer groups was asked to divide an amount of money between himself and the stranger, and between himself and another member of their farmer cooperative. And this allows me to measure and this altruistic behavior toward the stranger and toward a member of the farmer cooperative. This is a general strategy that people can adopt in order to distinguish between these 2 forms of solidarity. The one thing that you should keep in mind is that anytime you go from a complete stranger to someone that is closer to you in some sense, you'll see a bump in donations, in contributions to the other player. So one thing that people should keep in mind in adopting this behavioral game and bringing it to the field is that you need to compare the group of interest, in my case is like the farmer cooperative, to some other group, the contribution to some other group that would be at the same level of social distance. So in my case, what I did was to ask half of the participants to divide their endowment between themselves and the stranger again, and themselves and someone from their village. Whereas, like, both the village and the farmer cooperatives are at the same level of social distance.
What is PO?
Is the producer organization. So is the farmer organization. So essentially, what I found was that individuals do give more to members of a farmer group than to a stranger, and they also end up like giving more to someone from the farmer group rather than to their village, and I take this as a measure of the fact that these groups were able to develop some sort of group solidarity. Then I went on and I tried to measure the other two type of mechanisms through another game, which is a public goods game. And in this case, the idea was to try to measure reciprocity, the way in which I described before, meaning like a tit-for-tat strategy, from some sort of common sanctioning. And
Sonja had a question.
yes, please. Yep. Yeah, it's essentially the equivalent of a daily wage of a daily wage. Yeah, the salary for a day.
And how much is that in US dollars?
It's $1, almost. Yeah, back then it was 1.3. It varies, but yeah. So essentially, in a public goods game, I won't get into the details, but this is a game that captures perfectly the three-rider problem. In terms of like people having to allocate money to themselves rather than to a common pot. And again, here I was able to measure these two different mechanisms by introducing variants again in this game. In one case, the participants were allowed to communicate with each other. Public goods games are played over time, over a series of rounds. And in the second case, they were allowed to sanction each other. So without getting into the details, the point here is the following. What I did was to study how farmer groups overcome collective action problems by mixing like the collection of a bunch of empirical evidence, and this was based on observational data. I asked them to provide information about their farmer activities, their own individual activities. I collected network data. But the step forward was to also have the same people, these farmers, who are facing collective action problems on a regular basis, to play these behavioral games that supposedly capture different mechanisms. And through the game, I was able to assess some sort of causal relationship between both group identity and levels of altruism and communication and sanctioning. The last step here was to ask whether this behavior in the games maps into their behavior in the farmer groups. So essentially the logic is if the games are telling us anything about their experience, we would actually be able to see which of these mechanisms that we measure in the game relates to their farmer cooperative behavior. So whoever cooperated more in a game might be expected to cooperate more in real life. And indeed, I was able to show that people who ended up reciprocating more in the game were also more likely to participate in the farmer group activities, while the other two mechanisms, although present, they weren't predictive of their behavior in their real life. So the idea here was to use lab in the field experiments in order to increase the external validity of the games and try to identify which type of mechanisms are effective in real life. And where I see this type of research going, and where I think this could be interesting in general, is that the type of methodology can be applied to any other setting, and the contribution that this could give to our understanding of cooperation is that it would allow us to test theories of collective action. So there are a fair amount of theories out there, not 110. Essentially, the four mechanisms I identified do correspond to some basic theories, and it could allow us to define their scope conditions. So I don't think that these theories are, to sort of speak with the categories that Duncan used before, these theories are actually compatible. They simply might work better in some cases and less well in others. So for instance, I was studying farmer cooperatives. Their main activity is an economic activity. Farmers participate in these organizations because they want to make more money. So reciprocity based on some sort of norms that lead them to cooperate rather than free ride is more likely to be an explanation of their behavior than, let's say, group membership, group identification. While, for instance, if I were to study traditional forms of participation in political groups or extreme forms of political mobilization, I would expect that group identity would play a greater role in explaining how these groups overcome collective action problems. So the idea here is that by moving to the field, we do define the scope conditions of theories, which is in a theoretical agenda slightly different from an agenda in which you want to find theories that apply everywhere in the same way. But I think it's also a more fruitful one. And the second way in which I believe this approach can help us improve our tools in order to understand society is in the study of social capital in complex societies. And I won't go over the details here, but essentially the concept of social capital, which could be defined as the way in which individuals and groups use their networks in order to achieve a certain benefit, is currently based on a conception that is very much communitarian. It's based on the idea of mechanical solidarity that is based on similarity and homogeneity. And the core idea is that cohesive groups and close-knit networks are capable of lead to the emergence of shared cultures, trust, and peer sanctioning. And this idea of social capital works just fine when you are dealing with very homogeneous societies. But fortunately or unfortunately, our societies are complex based on differentiation and are increasingly more heterogeneous. And therefore, this conception that we inevitably use when we evoke this concept is not really helpful in allowing us to understand which are the mechanisms on the ground that allow groups of people to cooperate. And what I'm suggesting here is that we should probably move away from a conceptualization of social capital based on mechanical solidarity to one in which individuals cooperate on the basis of other principles. Unfortunately, we do not know that much about these other mechanisms, and the only literature that is actually leading in that direction is literature that uses behavioral games. So to close the circle, I started from an experience with farmers in Uganda, but the general idea here is to use the same strategy, behavioral games, along with some notions of collective good, in order to study other and more, if you want, more prominent and pressing problems like the emergence of cooperation in complex societies. Yeah?
Very nice research, and I can see the importance of your last point of moving from basically strong solidarity conceptions to weak solidarity. But what I would like to add is that in our research we find that the two groups of what makes people likely to cooperate, the two groups of factors actually interact a great deal. Let me give you an example. We find that sanctions work very differently when they are simply a control by an outsider. And you have that in lots of studies, in common pool thing in Oslo. If sanctions are imposed from the outside, they will basically not work very well, because then you get the monitoring problem, people try to evade. So sanctions work the best if there is already some conception of a common project. And so that sanctions actually protect a certain common value. And then we find that it's this, the way sanctions work is not just that it makes me contribute more, but by knowing that there's a sanctioning regime, my feasibility belief of the project goes up because I know other people will be sanctioned as well. So the sanctioning mechanism runs for a great part on what I believe the sanctions will do to the behavior of others, rather than how the sanctions affect my own behavior. And so you do get these different factors to interact with.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, this is, as I mentioned, like this is a general classification, and within it, you can think of like different modalities in which this, like in this case, like sanctioning dynamics plays out, as well as what you were saying, meaning interactions between every mechanism and then every other one. So, for instance, like if there is already some sense of group solidarity, it would be easier, for instance, for reciprocity to emerge or to reinforce itself, as well as sanctioning might actually be more effective. So I'm totally on board with it. Yeah.
There's quite a movement right now in bringing these field experiments to real populations. And it's nice to see some external validity being confirmed here and there. I'm sure the experimental economists are quite happy about that. But I think the next step, of course, is that you would like, I mean, here you're back to cross-sectional design, basically, because both is happening at the same time, and it is not quite sure in which direction things are flowing. Is it that people choose in this experiment because they have some attribute from the survey, or is it actually that the elicitive behavior is predicting what we are doing? And this is pointing a little bit into what Victor assigned me to do later on, is talking longitudinal, that it would, of course, be much more reassuring to take this a step further and to go today and run an experiment and to see 3 years later whether in any sense this responds to actual strategic behavior by real people. And I think that is sort of, you're bridging towards that next step, because it's a logical next thing to do, like it has been in any cross-sectional research. We're asking people to do time series because you want to get to causalities, and the same thing is here. If experiments are supposed to be really valuable, you got to have a predictive power. And but I'm very happy to see you doing this, particularly as you're sort of accomplishing a lot by taking standard dictator games into a sociological journal. So I think that's sort of the methodological import that is very hard to do.
We'll see about that.
Well, I see at least that you're doing a very good justification job, and I guess I get a learn from that. To bring one method to the next field is I think a hard thing to do for all the reasons we discussed in the prior session.
Actually, I mean, this observation you're making, which is totally well taken, is actually something that might be interesting when you think about taking something from one field, in this case behavioral games, and using it in another field or for a slightly different purpose. So, for instance, when I present this type of work to a crowd of like hardcore economists, like I get a lot of questions about the games per se and what they mean, because they are less interested in how they map into reality, like their predictive capacity with respect to people's behavior in real life, than to the functioning of the game in itself. And they keep like telling, you know, I'm interested in the games per se because I believe that the experimental setting tells me something. But what I'm really using the games for is in order to measure things. That, for instance, like propensity to reciprocity, sensibility to sanctioning, that actually we cannot measure in any other way. And I did skip all this part in which I was discussing some literature on social capital and trust measures. And the point there is, like, if you look at this literature on, for instance, the relationship between ethnic heterogeneity and social capital, like these people are relying on really bad measures of trust, like self-reported measures of trust. So already just bringing in games, we are like moving from attitudes or self-reported measure of something to like actual behavior. But your point is important, meaning we don't really know what these games are doing. And my default is, since I'm a sociologist, is these farmers have been like interacting with each other for like 4 or 5 years. And then I get them and they put them together as a group or part of a group in a setting that asks them to do something. And my default, my assumption about what they are doing is, in this game, like this game is gonna elicit dynamics that they experience in real life. Your question is like, maybe the game is doing something else. Maybe like they behave in the game in a way which is different from real life. So that's totally true. That's possible, and one can actually go to and try to do some pre-post type of game participation. You can actually, for instance, in my case, if my point is that they behave toward each other in a certain way, I can actually have them play with total strangers, and I expect their behavior in these cooperative games to be different. So if I believe that reciprocity has emerged in this farmers group, I don't expect the same people to be reciprocal to a complete stranger. So I can do that in that way, but yeah.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.